I was a creative child and quite a dreamy child. I was one of those children who was always off in their own world and creating worlds. And I come from a large family, and seeking solitude in a space full of people was always something that was very important to me. And so I learned to go into these almost daydreamscapes, and these were fed through a love of nature. And also in our house we had lots of books, and my mum was an RE teacher, so we had this real amazing access to Eastern religions and Eastern philosophies, and books like the Bhagavad Gita, and then stories from ancient Egypt and Celtic myths and legends and all these fairy stories. So I think when you're growing up, you're very influenced by the things you find, and it's only later when you give yourself time as an artist, I think, to develop your practice, you start to make connections between the things that you were curious about as a child. And it's a really interesting process, and it's a bit of a gift to be able to do that. I don't think many of us get that chance in our lives, in our everyday lives, to really go within and really find where our curiosities would take us, were it not for the prescribed routes that we're supposed to go down. And it's an interesting thing because I didn't come to art immediately. I tried to be other things. I tried very hard to be something other than an artist, because I didn't come from much money, and so the need for a proper job, as it were, was always there, but I was never able to commit fully to anything else, which is quite an interesting thing. I talked to another artist about this the other day, and I never could commit to another career. It was always there, that kernel, that little seed that from childhood, that this was where my most connected place was, when I was painting and creating. And so it was only in 2014 that I was able to really take my creativity in my own hands. I moved here to Belgrade, I got a studio, and I committed to painting full time. And since then, all of this language, all of my curiosities, all of the input, the stories and the passions from childhood, the fairy stories, the Eastern philosophies, nature, my joy for the world has come out in my work, and this is a really beautiful thing. It feels a very exciting time to be an artist at the moment. And the pieces that I'm working on at the moment are all very connected to this idea of balance, of holding on and letting go. And that's actually part of my process as I paint, because the strokes themselves are quite contained. I'm not I don't splash paint around, something like Jackson Pollock, or that kind of wildness to it. There is a slow grace within all the marks that I'm trying to make, but there's also a balance between that movement and then getting caught up in too much precision. So as I'm working, I'm trying to release all the time, release this element of control and allow the work to form itself. And when I work in layers, the forms relate to one another, so there's this constant gain and loss of marks as new marks come over the top. But I never consciously erase a previous brushstroke. There's always an element of it just being overlaid with new growth in some way. And this is another area that I'm really interested in, the way that nature reclaims spaces. And so I think somewhere within the work that I'm creating, there's always this idea of the overgrown and the relayering and regrowing of work. And then there's a point, obviously, at which I stop, and then the piece goes into its own world and goes out into the world, hopefully. So I'm very connected to my work. It's very much a part of my lifestyle to be constantly seeking this space of freedom, this inner world that we often lose touch with. And I hope that the work that I create allows the viewer to bring their own story into it, to connect to it with their own inner worlds. That's the best and most powerful connection that I hope to make between the viewer and my artwork.